So what we're gonna do is, I'm gonna face the camera with it for a second and then I'll show you guys. We're gonna create this piece right here. So this front bodice piece with the lapel. And what we have going on is we have buttons. For our full-size one, our buttons are gonna be 5/8 of an inch. And in chapter 16, it talks about how to figure out how big to make this area based on your buttons. So it's not always the same answer. It depends on the size of your buttons. And the sample we're gonna use is a 5/8 of an inch button. So we'll talk about that, and then the shaping of the lapel. They give you a basic explanation of it, but really the shape of the lapel is a design decision. So I'm gonna give you some specific measurements based on the shirt that we're trying to replicate that's in canvas, that's that dress from ModCloth. So I'll talk about those measurements too. So the first step to this is to trace off your 2-dart block. So we're trying to create something that looks like this. So I pulled this out so you could see ultimately how much brown paper you're gonna need. After you copy off your 2-dart block, which is the dot paper part that you see here, you are gonna need extra for the shape of your lapel, and you're gonna need extra for your seam allowance. This one isn't done properly, I'm noticing. You're gonna need extra for your seam allowance. So what you want is, you want an extra like 4 inches beyond the center front, and you want an extra 2 inches beyond the widest point of the side, which is where the dart sticks out. And then in the lengthwise direction, you want at least 2 inches beyond high point shoulder. But once you figure that out, you have to carefully place your cutout dot paper on your brown paper so that you don't run out of space as you're drafting. So you can give yourself, I think I said something like, I don't know, 20 by 22, something like that. So you can give yourself extra beyond that, but just know that this is what you're aiming for. So think about it when you start laying your stuff down. And it's not the end of the world if you run out of paper, right? It's just paper, you can tape it on, but for some of us it's really annoying when it looks kind of Frankensteined. Mm-hmm. So anyway, and it makes it weaker. It's always like a little corner that you run off on, and that's the weak point that drives you nuts. But if you do have to tape paper on, tape it from both sides, so it's sandwiched with tape. So where the 2 pieces overlap in the back, put tape, and where the 2 pieces overlap in the front, put tape, and that'll help secure it. I'm sure I have some examples of that because I always make that mistake. So the first thing I usually do is I usually figure out where my piece that I'm tracing off is going to fit on my dot paper. And then based on that, I go ahead and draw my straight grain line. And then I put my piece up against my grain line. And then I trace it off. And one of the things that we're gonna need is we need to know where the bust level is. So there's, on our block, the way we've done it, and it's not the only way to do it, but the way we've done it, there isn't anything on the center front side to tell you where the bust level is. So you'll just have to make a little mark on your dot paper. So make sure you trace off all your punch holes so that you have those. And the bust point is another nice reference point for bust level, and then make a mark for bust level. And then, so I'll do that again over here. I already have one partially traced off. So I'll put that guy there, make a little mark for where bust level is. And then bust level will intersect that mark I made on the center front, but it's also gonna go through the bust point, and it's gonna ultimately hit the dart leg over here. So I have a few spots where I can figure out where bust level is. And then I need to make sure I draw that line. And when I draw that bust level line, I'm just gonna extend it a little bit because I know I'm gonna need it out a little bit from the front for my collar. So the first thing we need to know is for our buttons, which are 5/8 of an inch, we need to extend it for the 5/8 of an inch button. So what your book says is you take the size of your button and you add 1/8 of an inch. So for us, 5/8 of an inch plus another 1/8 is 3/4. So from the center front, I'm gonna bump it out 3/4 of an inch for my 5/8 of an inch button. So I'm just gonna put my ruler there. I've taped it down to brown paper. I didn't figure you needed to see me do that on camera. So I made a copy and cut it out before I started the camera, and I taped it down onto brown paper. Ultimately, I'm going to need 2 layers. It doesn't need to be on the fold, bless you. It doesn't need to be on the fold, but I just cut a piece and folded it in half, made sure I had a margin around my piece, and taped it down. And on this too, before I taped it down, I drew my center front grain line and then taped my paper to my center front grain line. And then, like you saw, I drew my bust level, and I drew it all the way across and extended it past. If I had drawn it on my dot and then taped it down, I just would have put my ruler up and extended it a little bit. So this distance here is 3/4 of an inch. Let me get a mechanical pencil. So this distance here, I'm trying to find a good place to put it. This will be good. So that is 3/4 of an inch. And why? So a 5/8 inch button plus 1/8 of an inch. So that's why 3/4. The other thing is, if you look at the full size one of these, when this shuts, the collar isn't all the way on center front. So for us, what we're gonna do on our full size one is from center front, we're just gonna take our ruler and measure back towards the shoulder along the neckline a 1/2 inch and make a mark. So that distance is a 1/2 inch, and that is our collar notch. So later, when we go to measure our front neck for the collar, we're just gonna measure up to that notch. So from the high point shoulder to the collar notch, and you're going to be measuring the dot paper. Even if we've added seam allowance to this, you're going to be measuring the dot paper, okay? So 3/4 of an inch, what else do we need to do? Oh, we need to bump out our lapel. This part here is, they talk about it a little bit in chapter 17, the very first part, but this is kind of a design decision, and they talk about it in another section of the book too, in the jacket section, which is not an area of the book that we're going to cover much of, if any. This would be the only spot really. They talk a little bit about lapel design there too. But basically, we're trying to knock off a dress, and so I just used proportions to figure it out. And it looks to me like from the center front, the lapel that we want from the center front will stick out about 1.5 inches. So I'm just going to go from the center front and square out 1.5 inches. And then I'm going to make sure I know where that 1.5 inch intersection is, so I know exactly where I'm hitting. The next thing I need to do in order to create the lapel is figure out where the break point is. For this, what we're going to do is we're going to measure from the bust level up towards the neck 1/2 inch, and we're going to call that our break point. The break point is where the shirt or jacket starts to fold back. So that right there, that's the break point. So where it goes to curl back. And it curls from the high point shoulder. I'll just make a little dotted line so you can see where the break point is. So it's from the high point shoulder to this line that I just drew. So this is going to be our fold line. They call it actually a roll line for a collar. So that right there is our roll line. So that's from HPS to break point. And our break point, which is right here, break point is up from the bust level 1/2 inch. So now from our break point to that 1.5 inches, so let me also draw that, this direction is 1 1/2 inches. And that's just a design decision. I could have made it 10 inches if I wanted, and I'd get an entirely different look. But for this dress, 1.5 seemed to be the right measurement. So I'm going to draw from that 1.5 inch mark out from center front, and I'm going to intersect with the break point where it intersects with my extension for my button. And that is about it for the shaping, actually. I can square out for my center front. And then just FYI, for where the buttons are, they're on center. We're gonna put, for ours, we're gonna put 3 buttons. We're gonna have the first one be, or we'll say the last one be, 1.5 inches up from the waist. So up 1 and 1.5 inches. So that'll be button number 3. The first one is gonna be at the break point. So our first button will be there. This will be button number 1. And then the middle one, we'll just fold those 2 pieces and find the center, or measure. I'm trying to do math in my hair screw, so it looks like it's about there. So this will be button number 3. And just FYI, buttons are on center, and I borrowed somebody's button or circle template here, and there's a 5/8 button template there, and so I can just draw where my buttons will be. So I'm gonna have 1 button there, and we'll make a button template later. It's just a strip of paper with these markings on it and some punch holes to help people know where to place stuff. So those will be our buttons. We have our 3/4 extension, and we stuck this out here to create our lapel. And that's really all you need for the drafting portion of it. So once you have this drafted, we'll talk about adding the seam allowance, yada, yada, yada. But that's it, all right?